Thank you very much. I have a new title, Kassir, Heidegger, Japanese Philosophy, Imagination, and the Grounding of the Historical World. Not quite sure that title is even accurate. Introduction. As you all know, I read the Kyoto School from the perspective of a philosophy of culture. At present, I am focused on Nishitani's treatment of mythical poetic imagination and the relation it establishes between politics, standpoint of the historical world, and the religious standpoint of the field of emptiness. Much has been said about the implicit or explicit, intended or unintended involvement of some of the thinkers of the Kyoto School with ultranationalism during the war years. This, for me, is an historical question about individuals, not a philosophical question about their ideas. In short, it is not the question I am concerned with here. Part one sets out the basic lines of my reading of Nishitani's account of mythical poetic imagination and the relation it establishes between politics, the standpoint of the historical world, and the religious, the standpoint of the field of emptiness. Part two considers a lacuna in the research on Nishitani's account of the imagination, namely a comparison with Tanabe, Nakai, Kuki, and Miki's respective accounts of the schema and the productive imagination in Kant, and the importance of this for our understanding of their respective philosophical standpoints. This lacuna makes evident a second lacuna, the importance of the debate between Kassir and Heidegger on the nature of the schema and the role of the productive imagination in Kant at Davos in 1929. As it seems clear that Tanabe, Nakai, Kuki, and Miki are each developing their ideas through a critical engagement with the positions of Kassir and Heidegger in this debate. This lacuna has brought me to return to the original project that brought me to read the Kyoto School and be more explicit about my project on the philosophy of culture and contend that the Kyoto School can be read as located in a space between the contradictory hermeneutical horizons expressed by Kassir and Heidegger. Part one. In Worldview and Nation View in 1941, Nishitani maintains that the cultural crisis of his contemporary Japan has arisen because since the Meiji Restoration in Japan, the religious and the political have been separated. In this context, I would contend that Nishitani sets out his life's work in an allegory of an encounter between Daito Kokuchi and the Emperor Hanno Zono. The emperor began, "The Buddha's law facing the king's law on the same level, how unthinkable." The master replied, "The king's law facing the Buddha's law on the same level, how unthinkable." However, are they on the same level? No. Kokushi is, after all, literally the teacher of the nation. The allegory speaks of the distance that separates them, the role of the religious plays in awakening the political, and the nature of the encounter to a transmission beyond words. The emperor is said to have blushed and smiled. While the religious awakening springs forth from the very depths of our hearts, the mission of religion is only active when it acts as a real force within historical reality. Thus, on the one hand, the religious concerns the great matter for the individual. It is a transcending the self at the very core of the self, and thus, as such, the religious is not directly connected to the public life of the nation. On the other hand, it can and should be deeply connected to public life. A healthy relation between the religious and the political is one in which the self is temporarily removed from the public and then returns to the public. The unthinkable encounter of the political, the standpoint of the historical world, and the religious, the standpoint of the field of emptiness, can take place, however, only through, quote, a recollection of something mythical that directly unites the two. Nishitani insists that we must distinguish mythos from mythology. The word myth refers to two different levels. Mythos is a primary lived worldview, the fundamental experience that grounds a people's outlook and thus their self-understanding, and thus the ethos, ethical life of a nation. And mythology as a negation of the primordial worldview by an interpretation by the intellect. However, our intellectual interpretation of mythos always transforms it into the logos or idea of myth, into a mythology. Overcoming the disrootedness of the contemporary world requires a return to the sources of mythos, which Nishitani distinguishes from the political or ideologically constructed mythology, which undertakes the religionization of politics or the politicalization of religion, and thus turns religion into a political tool. In The Problem of Myth, 1959, Nishitani maintains that the recollection of myth is one of the fundamental problems for our understanding of religion and a living problem of our time. He goes on to clarify the nature of mythos. The position of myth is the position of the imagination, the Einbildungskraft, the imagination, namely a position of thinking by means of form images. Imagination here should be understood in this fundamental sense. Throughout his middle period, Nishitani deepens his understanding of the mythical poetic imagination. In the final chapters of What is Religion, 1961, Nishitani defines science, philosophy, religion, and Buddhism in terms of the specific nature of their confrontation with mythical life. Science grasps the mythical on the dimension of the outer shell of representations, which it vanishes as unscientific. In the self-centered attitude of scientism, we find a pure and simple negation of the mythical attitude, which is at the root of the advent of nihilism. Philosophy recognizes in the pre-logical mythical representations symbols of logos, which it then restores to the dimension of logos. The religious attitude is an existential demythologization by which the positive significance of mythos is revealed. It is a hermeneutical engagement with the historical hermeneutical expression of the mythical poetic imagination that seeks a return and a recovery of the original sense of mythical life, not a return to the objective content of past mythical images. The religious recognizes the existential element that composes the core of mythos, namely the direct existential confrontation with being in the world and the unique ratio this reveals, as we see these embodied in the mythical religious aspects of human existence in pre-scientific societies. Mythical representations are born of the wish to ask after the home ground of human Dasein. They contain a kind of intuition of the essence of being in the world, as a being in time as. Thus, the point of the return to mythos, as the standpoint of the fundamental imagination for Nishitani, is not a return to the mythos of the past, which can only be a return to an ideologically constructed mythology of the past that seeks to return to some beginning, a historical Ursprung of the world that would make the nation great again. The religious is not a religion, which always possesses a mythological element that implicates it in the religionization of politics or the politicalization of religion. Nishitani would have perhaps been more precise and asked, what is the religious, rather than what is religion? The religious is lost when it attempts to be an historically worldly institution. The religious is a revitalization of the standpoint of mythos that opens a historical world as a return to the power that is still working at the present in the deepest root of our life. It is a return to the fundamental fountainhead of the present historical and cultural life, to return to the mythical world as the genesis of every culture, the root from which every culture has come, namely the poetic imagination in a fundamental sense. This recollection of myth involves the rediscovery and opening up of the root of history in the present. It is a return to the beginning of history at the very depths of the present in which we are situated, and to draw from myth the energy of the mythical poetic imagination. We must use religion as a medium. Now, the reason for the split between the political and the religious that takes place in the construction of modern Japan and brings about the crisis of culture is that the religious no longer formed an element of the foundations of Japanese life world. And the reason for this was that Buddhism, as the historical worldly institution that embodies the religious, was stuck in the Middle Ages. Unlike other elements of the social political dimension of the Japanese life world, Buddhism as an institution had no modernity. There was not even a trace of internal effort to modernize. The role of religious thinking is to undertake an existential demythicalization, a hermeneutical engagement with the historical hermeneutical image world of the mythical poetic imagination. And for Nishitani, the dynamic of this demythification has been at work throughout the history of Buddhism and can even be said to be the unique feature of Buddhism, distinguishing it from other religions. The central aim of Nishitani's project, therefore, is to establish a modern expression of the Buddha way for the modern world. And he does this through a double confrontation with Kant's transcendental philosophy and Heidegger's existentialism. And this, I would argue, situates Nishitani in a space between the antithetical modes of hermeneutics developed by Husserl and Heidegger. From his worldview and nationalism or nation view of 1941 to Religion and Nothingness, 1961, Nishitani deepens his thematization of religion's hermeneutical and existential interpretation of the hermeneutical horizon of mythical poetic imagination. And this naturally segues into his analysis of the image and the elementary imagination in his later period, in such works as On Awareness and Emptiness and Soku, 1982. My reading of Nishitani thus challenges the wide-held view that before Emptiness and Soku, the problem of the imagination is nowhere treated in the thematic and systematic way, and that Nishitani's turn to the problem of the imagination remains a missing link in the study of Nishitani's philosophical development. The problem of the productive imagination has, I would contend, been there from the very beginning. Now, the unthinkable union of the political, the standpoint of the historical world, and the religious, the standpoint of the field of emptiness, takes place through the religious hermeneutical attitude towards the hermeneutical mythical poetic imagination as a thinking by means of form images. And again, the imagination here is to be understood in a fundamental or elementary sense as an ontologically productive. Nishitani's analysis of the mythical poetic imagination now focuses on the function of the elementary imagination and aesthetic presencing of emptiness and the imaging of emptiness, or perhaps better, the becoming an image of emptiness. It operates not only in poetry, but in the very scene showing of phenomenal reality, and in fact, in the poesies of the world itself. The appearance of reality as simply reality beyond language and all its logos and reason is the end of the way known of art and the beginning of the new way of religion. The Soku is, I would contend, the mechanism of aesthetic scene presencing that makes being transparent, that is, establishes a non-dual duality of being Soku emptiness. We are, I believe, brought back here to the project of the unthinkable encounter between the political and the religious, the Buddha law, Dharma, facing the king's law, the historical world of the nation. Now, allow me to step back and just state a few things about my reading of Nishitani. First, Nishitani employs a great many terms in a variety of languages to create a nexus that unpacks the mechanism of the imagination and its modes of presencing. We find imija in the katakana, the build in German, imagio in Latin, and in English we find form, shape, mode, type, model, pattern, and figure. In kanji, we have the kage, keizo, kata, katachi, zo, yo, and sugata, sama, sho. And in hiragana, we have the katachi, kata, sugata, sama, and utsutsu. We should not be too quick to translate these terms nor to equate them. Everything is image and nothing more. However, the image is the path to concrete things. And the things that itself appears by being reflected and transferred into the appearance of things, the thing itself, as a provisional illusion-like existence, which is what is meant by the imaging of nothingness and the making being transparent. Nishitani thus descends the ladder of the imagination that unites sense and sensibility, tracing the sense of words and ideas back to the original sensible appearance of the image, form images and form of things from which the sense of words and the ideas are derived, and then back further to the form of appearance of emptiness par excellence, namely the sugata, in which emptiness itself becomes manifest as the fundamental experience of the attunement of Buddha nature, emptiness. The prefix su suggests a basic or straightforwardness. The su announces the nobility of this kata, the su kata, distinguishing it from the static form of the katachi. Sugata is the ephemeral form of presencing of impermanence prior to the significant interpretation through the static forms of words or concepts. One still speaks of the impermanence or ephemeral presencing of the sakura no sagata. It is no doubt, no accident that the phonetic pronunciation of sagata echoes the Pali and Sanskrit term for Buddha nature, the well-gone one. And in the Mahayana tradition, the Sugata is the whole Shin, the Dharma body, the purest form of Buddha nature. Nishitani's descent through language back to the fundamental experience marks a return to the beginning of history at the very depths of the present in which we are situated, spoken about above. What is exposed here is the root of the present in the formation of the sugata, of the ephemeral form of presencing arising as it perishes by the imagination in the process of being transformed into form images of the object of the world. It is a poem that takes the actuality of reality itself as its image, a poem that spells out the words that the facts themselves speak. The problem is that the words of language and thought and the ephemeral form of presencing arising as it perishes manifested in the sugata are antithetical hermeneutical horizons. The signification of words signify a repetition, stability, and identity over time, whereas the sugata as the ephemeral form of presencing arising as it perishes signifies an incalculable singularity that happens in experience, as pure experience, as the unity of intuition and thought, or the being of in time as time, to speak with Nishida and Nishitani, that is at once found beyond the horizon of signification, and yet at the very same time, at the very heart of signification as the event of signification itself. Finally, Nishitani traces the ephemeral presencing of the Sugata of the world and emptiness back to the mechanisms of the presencing that is captured through another nexus of signifiers through which we once again hear the Yamato language, utsutsu. The mechanism of utsutsu is the mechanism of aesthetic scene presencing that makes the being transparent, that is, establishes a non-dual duality of being soku emptiness. Strictly speaking, utsutsu is not a word or a concept, but the source of words and concepts. Thus, it can never be translated into any language, the act of translation itself being yet another form of utsutsu. Thus, utsutsu has a mobile meaning that can only ever be signified by other terms that differentiate it and displace it, such as to transfer or change, to copy or transcribe, duplicate, to photograph, to reflect, to project, all is said by utsutsu. What is more, utsutsu can never be seen because it is the movement of immediate seeing itself, and thus it manifests the appearance of appearance and utsutsu of the transient presence of the world. It represents the dynamic relation of utsutsu, utsutsu, utsutsu. Again, as utsutsu, to transfer mirror, indicates, the structure of reflection signifies an equivalent projection such that transferring, reflecting, and reversing. Thus, whenever one is moved from one place to another, and it has a relational equivalence, then people can say it has been utsutsu. In short, it is the mediated immediacy of the soku that forms the bidirectional reflecting, transferring, and mirroring of the binary opposites, the movement from the invisible to the visible, and from the visible to the invisible, that forms the event of presencing. Finally, the original meaning of utsu suggests the appearance of some aspect of reality that momentarily surfaces out of the shadows. The utsumaike signifies the empty sakata found in the tales of Jinji as a symbol of the effervescence of life that evokes the pathos of ephemeral things. Some quotes to illustrate everything that I've been saying. When we hear the sound of the sukata, the image of the sukata is given to us along with its sound. The aesthetic perception of looking at the T-bowl cannot be achieved without the form image. Form image is the factor that gives the T-bowl the name T-bowl. The emotions that arise when we look at the sugata of a mountain village in winter, and the impression that the mountain village is always lonely, but even lonelier than usual in winter, are projected directly onto the sugata and used to describe it. The world takes on the sugata of the unlimited compartmentalization that spreads across the entire world. A person who hears the crying voice of the sugata approaches the tree, for example, and recognizes the sugata of the sugata of the it's going to continue. This view is the ground for looking at matter from within. Its position is fundamentally a transition from the matter to its image. The image that is one with the matter is the image that has been manifested in its unique sugata. The sugata is the appearance of great light that is always in the movement of light. It manifests in the dust, dancing in the wind, in all living creatures in the world, in all phenomena that manifest themselves in light as light, in time as time. Such is the mythical poetic connection between the everyday political, the historical world, and the religious spoken of in 1941. a standpoint in which Nishitani said in 1938, we can, from the bit of fish on our plate, envision its swimming sugata in a Kuroshio current and feel directly beneath us the life that runs common through the fish and ourselves. We can close this section with one long quote from Nishitani's lecture on Dogen's Gonzo, and a short quote from What is Religion that bring us full circle to the unthinkable encounter between the emperor and Kokushi through the mythical poetic imagination. So this quote has all the terms that we've been defining. The character for mirror is used here as a metaphor to describe the sugata. So again, the sugata is playing on this word as a direct kata, but also the meaning of Buddha nature. So every time you hear sugata, you should be hearing Buddha nature. Of the entire universe is a giant mirror. In other words, everything and anything, mountains, rivers, stars, and the sun, everything else, all being, all dharma, the world, as we would say in the modern terms, is making an appearance here. It is a sugata of the universe as it is reflected in a single great mirror. In such cases, the transferred sugata is the mirror, is in the mirror, is the thing itself existing there. So it is different from the human heart. When something is outside of this and utsuru into the human heart, it is in the very ordinary sense a sugata of something reflected in a mirror. In this case, the thing is outside of the mirror, and the image of the thing, that is its image in the utsuru, in the mirror. When a human being thinks about or looks at something, it is this form. It is not the very thing itself, but its image that is utsuru in the mirror. The connection between utsutsu and sugata is made clear in these ku and time, but it's sunata and time. Nishitani writes, with respect to the koto of samsara soku nirvana, I have said that its meaning is apprehended existentially in such a way that the mind of the Tathagata utsuru into the mind of man, and the mind of man utsuru into the mind of the Tathagata. I have also spoken of this ko-utsuru as the realization of the reality of the soku. Soku is thus a bidirectional of utsutsu that forms the mediated immediacy of this special transmission from heart to heart that takes place beyond words and letters. The encounter between people is a poetic encounter in itself and is equal to the beauty of the plum blossom and willows. A quote from Nishitani. How am I doing for time, Enrico? We're okay? So, part two. For many years, I've worked on a philosophy of culture that would attempt to unite Cassir's transcendental account of the different symbolic forms that are world-forming and Heidegger's existential account of the finitude of Dasein, whose historicity grounds our being in the world. The original title of this project was The Thinking of the Cultural Event, which is inspired by Derrida's 1998 essay, Typewriter Ribbon, in which Derrida defines the concern of thinking, animating the double bind of the possibility and impossibility of moving beyond philosophy in terms of an antithetical opposition between what he calls the machine, textuality or language, and the event, the immediate lived facticity of thinking. The problem is that the notion of the machine and that of event are antithetical. The concept of signification signifies a repetition, stability, and identity over time, whereas the concept of the event signifies an incalculable singularity that happens in experience, as a pure experience, as the unity of intuition and thought, or as a being in time as time, to once again speak with Nishida or Nishitani, that is at once found beyond the horizon of signification and yet at the very heart of signification as the very event of signification itself. Anyone familiar with Cassirer and Heidegger's philosophy and their irreconcilable interpretations of the productive imagination in the schema and Kant will appreciate that the endeavor to unite their philosophical standpoints encountered no shortage of obstacles. Uniting a transcendental account of the factum of the world with an existential account of the facticity of the event of worlding is, as one of my critics said, akin to drawing a square circle. But then why pursue such an seemingly impossible project? I have three reasons. First, I would contend that the historical task of philosophy today is found in the project of a philosophy of culture that can re-establish the connection between the factum of the phenomenal world and the facticity of the concrete, unique event of worlding. This involves a return to Kant, whose critique of pure reason struck a death blow to the special metaphysics and by extension dogmatic theology, that is to say, a rational account of the facticity of God, world, and finitude that grounds the historical world from within the historical world. That is, a historical account of the transhistorical. As Nishitani repeatedly points out, determining the relationship between the three interpenetrating factors, the relation between the self and the world, the self and God, and between the God and the world, is the fundamental problem every philosophy and religion must address. That myth is based on the dynamic unity of these three factors means that the position of myth is the position of the imagination, namely the position of thinking by means of form images. Imagination here, as we have seen, understood in a fundamental sense. The second reason for continuing this project is that Cassirer and Heidegger repeatedly gesture towards it. While recognizing their antithetical positions, each seems to have encountered the internal limits of their own standpoint in the standpoint of the other. Without rejecting the other, each maintains that the other's project must be grounded in their own. For Heidegger, Cassirer's philosophy of symbolic forms must be grounded in a radical analytic of Dasein in the light of the question of the Sinn von Sein. For Cassirer, the project of fundamental ontology, which moves from the analytic of the existential finitude of Dasein to the interpretation of time as the horizon of the understanding of the Sinn von Sein, must pass through the domain of symbolic forming. Thus, I also agree with Nakai when he argues that despite their antithetical oppositions, a continuous curvature seems to flow between them, and that Cassirer and Heidegger were aware of this and even sought to move closer to the extreme opposite of their own positions. As Nakai rightly observes, Cassirer begins from the numerical rigor, descends to the concrete life, whereas Heidegger, beginning from the self-illumination of concrete life, tried to ascend to the essential structure. Thus, like my own, Nakai's project follows the Erdnianer's thread that connects the functionality of the transcendental form with the historical facticity of existence, which unites the kata in the originary existence. Thus, I am also sympathetic to Miki's and Nishitani's critique of both Cassirer and Heidegger and their respective attempts to rethink the imagination and ground it in nothingness or emptiness. This brings me to the third reason for not abandoning this project. I began to study Japanese philosophy 6 years ago, focusing on the Kyoto school. The more I read, the more convinced I became that the thinkers of the Kyoto school were, in different ways, engaged in what I have called the historical task of a philosophy of culture that operates in a space between the antithetical modes of hermeneutics developed by Cassirer and Heidegger. Let me be clear. While the thinkers of the Kyoto school read Cassirer and Heidegger, what is important to our understanding of the historical project of Japanese philosophy at the beginning of the 20th century is not the philosophies of Kusir and Heidegger per se, but the antithetical modes of hermeneutics that their philosophies assumed, which I would contend the Kyoto school seeks to reconcile. Philosophy of culture is a bidirectional hermeneutical event of worlding that forms a culture of self-awakening that establishes the existential embodied realization of a cultural event of worlding in a twofold sense of its self-understanding, Kusir, and its self-actualization, Heidegger, to speak with Nishitani. Nishida explicitly defines not only his philosophical project, but the historical task of philosophy in terms of a reconciliation of the transcendental philosophy and Lebensphilosophy, logic and life. The requirement of contemporary philosophy lies, Nishida writes, in the synthesis of these two modes of thinking. The task, as Kusir states, is to reconcile the immanence of life, the transcendence of the idea. And so I'll stop here, but the rest of my paper would go on to argue that the entire Kyoto school is situates itself in a hermeneutics of emptiness between the hermeneutics of signification, Kusir, and the hermeneutics of existence, Heidegger. And they can do this through a hermeneutics of nothingness or emptiness. And that means it's reconciling life and logic, which is essentially what the debate between Kusir and Heidegger was about. And then you can go to Tanabe and look at his world schema as opposed to the Zeit schema, and you see precisely he is developing this concept, which leads to his idea of this species from his engagement with the debate about the productive imagination. And sometimes he sides with Heidegger, but sometimes he sides with Kusir. Again, in DeVos, Kusir gives the species as an example of how Kant's productive imagination works in argument against Heidegger. Then I think you can go to Miki or Nakai, and Nakai explicitly sets out his project as trying to reconcile these two interpretations of the imagination through technology. Then you can go to Miki, and Miki in the anthropology again explicitly situates his project as between these two different competing interpretations and tries to find a middle road. And I would argue that Nishitani is also doing it, despite the fact that his account of mythos is identical to Kusir's. He then takes up the Heideggerian position that Kusir's account of the imagination, of mythical imagination, cannot be left as a human faculty, which is exactly what the debate's about. So this is sort of my attempt to reframe my own project, write another paper, and address the importance of Heidegger to Japanese philosophy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think先生、大丈夫です。どうぞ。
Can you hear me?
Yes.
LOFTS Sensei, thank you very much for your talk. Wonderful talk. I have three questions or comments, or not in the sense that I am against your talk, but in order to make my understanding clearer. First, you have quoted a dialogue between the Emperor Hanazono and Daito. And you have translated the one word with fushigi, unthinkable. I don't know which translation you have quoted, but in my understanding, the Japanese original word fushigi means, of course, also unthinkable, but also marvelous, wonderful. And in this case, in the case of the dialogue between Hanazono Emperor and the Daito, I would like to adopt this latter translation. Encounter is encounter between the emperor and the Daito is in spite of all differences, in spite of all spirit. The encounter is realized. Is it not marvelous? That is my understanding. And if, whereby, of course, the emperor says, you, Daito, is in front of me. And Daito says, you, the emperor, you are in front of me. The position of the both is a little different. But at any rate, the marvelous, wonderful encounter is already realized. When you uh, when you take this another translation of the word 不思議, would you add or correct something in your talk? I pose this question partly because you have, at the end of your lecture, you have talked about the reconcile of the immanence of life and transcendence of life. Do you mean that reconcile is not yet realized or already realized? So my first question has something to do in fundamental point of your talk. My second question is, you have used the word contend twice. I contend this and this and this. In my poor understanding of English, contend means an opposition against this and this, and including critics. And could you please once more clear the point against which you contend? That is my second question. The third question, you have quoted Derrida at the end of your talk. Will you agree when I say that utsusu or the figure which is utsusareru is something similar with the truth of Derrida? That is, perhaps we should have time to discuss on this third question. But in my view, Derrida's truth can be interpreted or understood also in connection with Buddhist idea. But perhaps this third question is apropos, is not central. And my first question is the first. So far, my question.
Okay, it's very wonderful to see you, or again. In terms of the unthinkable, marvelous, the translation is my own translation, and I was thinking about marvelous, but I sided away from it and sided with unthinkable, because I wanted to play on the idea of the possibility, impossibility in the Derrida aspect of my interpretation. And I also wanted it to be, there's a difference, I think, when the emperor says unthinkable and the master says unthinkable. And I think there's a shift in there. But marvelous is, I'm good with the word marvelous, and I think I can work with it because but I still liked unthinkable. I needed the challenge to continue to leave the connection unprecedented without making it obvious. Because if you just go with marvelous, then the problem is there's no
Only one comment.
yeah.
The encounter between the two, between emperor and Daito master, is when you say unthinkable, but still the fact that the both have encountered is realized as a fact. Why is it unthinkable?
Because it can't be brought up to the level of logos or discourse. It has to remain a pre-logical or spoken thing. It's an encounter that happens outside of language. And so therefore it by definition can't be thought. And this is why I wanted the unthinkable, because I wanted to say that there is an encounter here, and it is a marvelous encounter, but it's an encounter that happens, it's a transmission of beyond words. And this is transmission beyond the words is by definition going to be unthinkable because we think through language.
Do you think that Dogen wants or tries to begin a theoretical discussion regarding this dialogue, or simple description of the marvelous encounter? That is my understanding, and I have an impression that you try to begin a theoretical interpretation, hermeneutics, regarding the word fushigi. Of course, that is also possible, but somehow far from the dialogue. That is my.
Mhm. Mm.
Okay, is that has something to do with the point against which you tried to contend? That is my second question.
I use contend a number of times. I think it's about 6 times. So, for example, the problem of the productive imagination. I have a long list of important scholars who suggested that the Nishitani's interest in the productive imagination is part of his later work. I have another work right here that uses his later. So it's the later Nishitani that deals with the imagination. And so I am arguing against this seemingly widespread understanding that Nishitani's engagement with imagination is central to his later thought, but not his middle thought or early thought. And my argument is no, he's been talking about the productive imagination at least since 1941. And this is what really defines his project. So in that sense, I am arguing against a certain tradition. When I say that the soku is, I contend, the mechanism of aesthetic seeing, again, here I think I am going against a standard interpretation of how the soku works as almost, you see translations as form is emptiness, emptiness is form. No, I'm saying that this is the aesthetic mechanism of disclosing closing. This is, And so I do think I'm arguing against a standard interpretation of that. I say that I would contend that the historical task of philosophy today is found in the project of philosophy of culture. But of course, I'm saying that this is all philosophy today is engaged in this philosophy project. In fact, since Kant, and Kant becomes culturalized and historicized in the 20th century, philosophy, this is the challenge of philosophy today. And that is, I think, not everybody would agree with that.
Thank you very much. I agree with your interpretation. I understand now your talk better. Regarding the third question, I would like to add only one thing. I'm interested in your view because you have once said in connection with the word utsutsu, you have said kagami no soto no mono, the thing outside of the mirror. And I have an impression that in your understanding, there is a kind of a difference between the real thing and the thing which is mirrored, figured, utsusareru in the mirror. But in my understanding regarding Derrida, or in his word of trust, I have an impression that his thinking, his thought is somehow near to the Buddhist idea of being, namely that there is no thing outside of the mirror. Everything is utsusu, image, and there is no contrast, no opposition between thing which is real. The thing which is real, this idea is negated in Buddhism, so that I have thought that Derrida's thought of trust is quite near to the Buddhist thinking of Utsu. So that is the background of my third question.
I think I would want to argue that Derrida's thinking is similar to Buddhism's thinking in the sense that its relationship to the image and the sort of metaphysics that the image necessarily introduces into thinking. That is to say that there is some thing that is represented that you can never get to. And then, of course, even the discussion to try to get to it is already a metaphysical problem. So I think Derrida's thinking, the sort of strategy of Derrida's thinking is similar to the strategy of that you'll find in Buddhism, and a certain type of Buddhism. However, I don't believe that Derrida is fully able to escape from the structures he's resisting. I don't think he has an intellectual tradition that has spent, centuries, if not millennia, trying to understand this type of dynamic, and therefore has tools and resources and ways of doing things that are well suited for this dynamic of thinking. And so at the end of the day, I would argue that while Derrida comes close to it, he gets he can't escape from language. For example, Derrida can't exit language and come back into language. That's not a possibility for Derrida, but it's clearly a possibility for Nishitani. It's a possibility for Ueda. It's a possibility for Dogen. You can exit language and then return into language. But there's this type of dynamic would make no sense in Derrida. So Derrida cannot get out of language.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. The point of my third question is, do you believe that there is an opposition between the thing outside of the mirror and the image in the mirror? That is my impression, which I have heard from your talk. And do you believe that Nishitani also thinks so? There is a contrast or opposition between the thing, real thing outside of the mirror, or everything is in the mirror.
Everything is in the mirror.
Okay. Then
There could be no outside the mirror.
You have once used this expression. I'm not sure if I have understood the context of the talk, but once you have said the thing is outside of the mirror. And so I wanted to confirm what you have meant with this word.
This is a quote from Nishitani in his lectures on Dogen.
Mhm.
And he says, in this case, the thing is, okay, it has to go, we have to go back. When something is outside and reflected in the heart mind, it is in the very original sense a sugata of something reflected in the mirror. So he almost deconstructs, he posits something outside, but then he immediately almost deconstructs the notion of this outside and says that it was always inside anyway.
Mhm. Thank you.
In this case, the thing, mono, and in kanji, is outside the mirror, and the image of the thing, that is, the image is reflected or transferred in the mirror. But then he, again, deconstructs that there is only the image. There is no thing beyond the image.
Mhm.
Is that?
Thank you. Thank you.
But that's a direct quote from Nishitani himself on his lectures on Dogen.
Okay. Thank
So I'm not responsible for that. Except that.
Yeah, thank you so much for this paper. I think I finally got what you're trying to do. So it was like, why is he so obsessed with Japanese philosophy? But now I get it. So thanks for that. That was very clear.
Obsessed.
Yeah, you are. You're like totally obsessed. But anyway, I understood now finally why and what your project is. So I find that that's really exciting and it's very good. It was good for me. I got it. Yeah. My comment, it's a comment. It's not an internal critique, but I will always have an external. It's maybe not a critique, but sort of a nagging thing, and that has to do with the lack of other people in this picture. I mean, you have this solitary person with even like an empty cicada and fish in the ocean, blah, blah, blah. Well, where are the people, right? So it's the we problem, or if you're going to talk about history, if you're going to talk about this as world, and it seems to me there is like a strange missing element that is other people, even though it's sort of snuck in our world, now. But actually, no one appears in this picture as your interlocutor, the Iron Dao, right? So it's somehow for me, that's sort of like it's not there. So it's a part of my feminist critique, and it's still the case. So if I were to contribute to this discussion, I will try to develop that, I think. So you should be warned.
Well,
The feminist critique is coming.
In this paper, though, I am sort of focused on just. I am writing this other paper for these unreasonable editors who want a paper right away Nishitani's mythical imagination, and that brought me into the problem of the relationship between religion and politics, which is a very difficult issue. So I've been trying to really work on that. And of course, that brought me to some lacunas that I'm looking at this and going, oh my, this is what I'm trying to do in my project, is to respond to these lacunas. In terms of the other, the social, there I think Nakai and Miki do a much better job
Well, that's why I like Miki, you see.
at bringing in that social dynamic. I think that Nishitani is not as in at least in the text that I've been reading, is not as robust for dealing with that problem. But in my work on Miki and Nakai, I definitely can bring in the social dynamic, and because I think there it is it's much clearer how they root all this in a dialogue, in a social dialogue.
Okay, yeah. I mean, internally, that's fine, right? I mean, everybody has their own particular way of doing this, so.
But in Nishitani, I don't see how you could, he doesn't seem to lend himself to that.
Yeah, okay, good. But it's good. Thanks very much. That was a good paper for me.
Yusa sensei, please.
Thank you so very much for
Good to see
the
you again.
workshop, which I find quite refreshing. Loft-san, you are a specialist of Kassir, and I try to read him, but I find him very difficult to get through. And but I wanted to approach him from a different perspective. You know, he had to leave Germany, correct, because of his Jewish ancestry, correct? How did he react to, for example, the entire German psyche, which, you know, enabled the Nazis to come in to power, because it was based on some sort of symbolic understanding of myth, isn't it? So I'm wondering how he understood the rise of that sort of demonic power from his scholarly intellectual perspective, and also from his existential perspective. And did he write something very accessible on this point? Because I think he has a lot to contribute, and yet we haven't heard much about him on that level. So it is just a very naive question. Thank you.
No, it's thank you. It's good to see you again. Towards the end of the war, Kassir was in exile, and the war started, and he realized that he had been sort of scholastic in his philosophy, had not really engaged the historical context of philosophy. You know, he knew he had to do this, but he hadn't done it. And he literally goes to a place for 2 weeks with just paper and writes in one draft a book called The Logic of the Cultural Sciences. And he wrote, it's a 250-page book. He wrote it in 2 weeks, one draft. He gave it to the publishers and said, print as is as soon as possible. And it's a shift in the way he's understanding culture. Then he wrote a book while he left for the United States. And here he wrote a book called The Myth of the State. It's his last work. And in it, this is one of the rare places where you find Kassir speaking in a personal tone, in a sense of saying, this is how it affected me. Because usually it's very scholastic, very, Mandarin. He's really objectified. He's just a philosopher. You don't really get a sense of the voice of the individual. And he speaks about the experience of seeing good people in Germany follow National Socialism down the pipeline. And he just can't understand how a small group of people could have moved such a large group of people, and people who were basically good people. So how does this happen? And he writes in The Myth of the State, Hegel comes off very badly as the architect of modern fascism, rightly or wrongly. And he gets to the contemporary problem. He says what the National Socialism was able to do, and the way they were going to do this is a technology of myth. They were able to weaponize the idea of mythical imagination. They were able to weaponize the idea that below the logos, there is a pathos that the culture is supposed to give shape to, not negate, but give shape to. It is and this is where myth works. It is the borderline between the pathos and logos of Miki. And so they developed this technology of myth, and he analyzes how they did this. Now, Albert Speer, one of the architects of National Socialism, when he was in prison, read Cassir's book, Myth of the State. And when he says, this is how they did it, he writes in his margins of the book, das ist richtig. And then Cassir goes through and analyzes the whole technique of myth and how they weaponize it. And at every single point, Albert Speer goes, yeah, that auch ist richtig. That auch ist richtig. And if you read it and think about Trump, and you think about the political discourses, and you think about the economic structures and how they manipulate the emotive structures of the human today, and you read Cassir's work, it is a blueprint of how to do it. And this is, he says, the genie is out of the box. For some time, from the beginning, shamans knew how the power of the symbol. They knew how to move people through a symbolic stuff. They knew how to create symbols that would then harness and shape the imaginary and harness and shape the pathos, the emotional. But now this has become a technique. Now the knowledge is out there. And then you ask yourself, you mentioned that, that National Socialism had created a myth. And of course, in my paper today, I also mentioned, what they do is they create the content of a past that will make, Germany great again. It will make America great again. And this is the politicization of the mythos, of the pathos. Cassir was very cognizant that this technique, once it's out, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. And so the question became for him, how do you fight against it? And he said that the weak link in this structure will always be the individual. The individual can be creative and can overcome pathos through logos. So, it was a naive view or naive hope in the Enlightenment, or a certain type of enlightenment, or a certain type of capacity of the individual to be critical, self-critical of them, of the structure. And when I look at people like Nakai, or I look at Miki, I see the same problems coming up. Nakai talks about self-critique. And Miki also, I think, sets up this dynamic. So the answer to your question is that Cassir was extraordinarily concerned about this at the end of during the war, analyzed what the National Socialism was doing and how they were able to move people, argued that they had learned how to weaponize myth and be able to utilize this to move people by creating a sort of if you will, a Dionysian message with or Apollonian image with a Dionysian message to speak with Nishida or Nietzsche. So if you go to the logic, if you go to the myth of the state, you'll see the technology of myth. It's like 3 pages and it sets it out clearly. And when I was reading I was reading the second volume of myth of symbolic forms, which deals with myth. And then when I got to Cassier's Myth of the State, when I was a young scholar, and I started to read it, and he said, "How could they have done this?" And I said, "Well, did you not read your own book? The blueprint is there. You handed him everything." I mean, this is the problem. We have ideas. We engage in intellectual discoveries of the nature of the human being, but we don't realize that knowledge can be then weaponized and used for something. And I think Cassier was cognizant of maybe even participating in the opening up of this new technology.
Thank you. I think, these are the real issues. I think at least I would like to be more conversant with.
Thank you very much, Steve, for your talk. And